For my technology integration project, I decided to create a Google Lit trip around the nonfiction text Into the Wild. So, a little background into why I chose this route and this project. Um, Into the Wild is a nonfiction text that tells the story of Chris McCandless, who traveled to Alaska and rid himself of societal expectations. I use this text in my co-taught American literature class to help students connect to the difficult ideas that sit inside the text of Emerson and Thoreau. I have co-taught American Lit classes, which means that at least 10 of my students are special education students that require modifications in their learning plans. And so I have to come up with new and creative ways to engage students in text and to help them connect to something they know. And I found that Into the Wild is a text that does that. I wanted to come up with a project that kind of capitalized on that engagement that they have with this book and also with that text. Hence why I came up with this Google Lit. So my objectives with this lesson was, first of all, that I wanted the students to be able to follow Chris's journey. I wanted them to be able to map the relationships that he formed on his journey. And I wanted them to be able to use those relationships and the places to be able to further make connections to Emerson and Thoreau. I also wanted them to be able to learn how to use technology to produce a publishable product as a class. With these objectives in mind, how did I make this happen? First of all, I divided my students into groups based on locations in Chris's journey. And then I created collaborative class documents in Google Drive and discussion boards on Linoit. Here you can see a class Linoit board that I used to help my students collect textual evidence from Emerson and Thoreau to support different ideas in Into the Wild. We use these ideas then as a group to support connections that they were seeing in their location. From this point, I had each group then in a collaborative Google document where everybody is editing together begin the research process. And in that research process, students were able to then determine their roles in the group, what they were going to do. And then they began researching their location, who they met, how they met who Chris met, the connections that they made there, and other things that would be pertinent to go into our Google Lit trip for content. You can see the different questions that I formed. The great thing about this document is that it was live, unlike a handout that I would hand to students and then it's permanent and I couldn't change it based on how they are reacting. I was able to watch the students work and then know what kind of questions I needed to add or take away or reword as they were working through this to make sure that we were all working together. Another awesome aspect to this was these resources here. The students were able to share resources with each other by looking at the document. From this step, I had students then create a presentation document where they planned out their presentations that would go into the content for the Lit trip. So when you clicked on the location on the Lit trip, this content would be present, and the students would then people would be able to click on the links and see these students' presentations. Students plan these presentations out once again on this collaborative document, and I was able to see how they were planning their slides and what tools they were planning on using to create their presentation. Other teams could also see other people's ideas and grow from those. The most surprising aspect in this project for me was, as a teacher, I originally thought when I started to work on this that this was actually about creating the Google Lit trip and placing the Google Lit trip into Google Earth. But really this project had little to do with that aspect at all. That aspect was more data entry and what I found that me and my co-teacher did for the students after they created the content to go on the trip. What I really discovered is that the technology was more about creating the presentations and hosting their research. And so students then began to use multiple technologies that they either learned from me in an introduction or something they already knew about and were trying to use in a different way. So for example, we used tools like Powtoon, WeVideo, and some students used Screencast-O-Matic, and other students used Prezi. Powtoon was a new app for my students that I introduced. So was WeVideo and Screencast-O-Matic. And so repurposing this for them became something new and actually surprising for me as an instructor. So this project really used multiple apps and technologies throughout. The Linoit boards were wonderful ways for discussion. The collaborative docs made the scaffolding of this project possible. My co-teacher and myself were able to react instantly when the students needed feedback. We were also able to change our prompts or add to our prompts to make sure we were getting the responses that we needed from our students. Google Earth, which is what hosts our final published Google Lit Trip, is the technology, and I think about it as more like a funnel, a place to put the rest of these things that my students worked with. Students worked with presentation tools, as I mentioned before, Powtoons, Prezi, and WeVideo, and Google Slides. I used Google Forms as a way of conducting peer and self-evaluation. If I could do this project again, I would approach it from the sense that the content is what is being produced and is not as important as the actual lit trip itself. What I discovered is that when we created the lit trip, my co-teacher and I, we sat with the students, but we were actually the people entering the data. What the students really produced was the content, the presentations, the things that they could click on in the lit trip. I also would scaffold my Emerson and Thoreau connections even more. This project had so many different components that students were working on that I still felt like the Emerson and Thoreau connections got lost some. So I would connect that more. And I also would highlight the research component. That was something when I initially started this. I knew they were going to have to do research, but I did not appreciate the quantity of research that happened in this project and those standards that were being hit by the research. And so if I could do it again, I would really, really drive those standards home.